Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Youngyo Kim. After a year in office, the Biden administration released its official Indo-Pacific strategy, stressing the intensifying American focus in the region. And soon after this, a trilateral meeting among the US, South Korea, and Japan took place in Hawaii, which the State Department said will deepen cooperation in confronting challenges together. Meanwhile, the US Air Force deployed 4 nuclear-capable bombers to Guam, which drew a lot of attention. Today, we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Mark Tokola, Vice President of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Mr. Tokola had served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul. Robert Manning also joins me today. Mr. Manning is Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. He served in the U.S. government for 15 years, including the State Department. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both today.
Happy to be here.
Pleasure.
First, we will start with the news of the deployment of the 4 B-52 nuclear-capable bombers in Guam. Mr. Tokola, is this unusual for the military to disclose the fact about such deployment?
It's actually not. I mean, these are announced in U.S. Air Force press releases. You called it a rare move or unusual, and that's true. It's rare enough that we're talking about it, so it got our attention. At the same time, it's not highly unusual either. In fact, on the same day that the 4 B-52s arrived in Guam, U.S. Air Force sent 4 B-52s to Fairfield Royal Air Force Base in England. They arrived the same time. And last year, there was a deployment of 6 B-52s to Qatar. So using B-52s as visible symbols of deterrence and alliance is not a highly unusual thing, but enough to get our attention. So it's made public, that's true. I think there are 3 audiences for it. One is for our opponents. So people can see, our opponents, that the U.S. is able to take military steps to counter hostile military steps on the other side. Partly it's for our allies. So our allies can see that mutual deterrence is a real thing, not just rhetoric. And the third audience is the American public. So they can see, too, that the U.S. public is able to take steps. And so I think for those 3 audiences, it's necessary that these moves be made public. You know, B-52s, like aircraft carriers, are highly visible symbols of U.S. power. They're part of the U.S. power vocabulary.
Mr. Manning, how did you take the news?
I don't disagree with anything Mark said. I think there are multiple purposes. I think in part we've watched North Korea 11 missile tests just in the month of January, and the U.S. has not really made much of a response. So that's one element, and then the continued tensions with China. So I think it's designed to send a message to both North Korea and China, and I think it's also designed as an act of reassurance for our allies and partners in the region.
And now, the U.S. seems to be working to strengthen its military alliance. It recently had joint military drills with Japan and Australia, although the large-scale military exercises between the U.S. and South Korea have been delayed for quite a few years now. Mr. Tokola, is there a growing need for the U.S. to level up its military alliance?
Those are 2 different questions, I think. One is about, are exercises necessary? And at some point they are, but they can be done at different levels and different times. But sooner or later, you do need to have actual exercises between the U.S. forces and allied forces to show that they work well together. It's a necessary practice. The other question is whether we need to adjust the U.S. military posture, whether changes are necessary. You called it leveling up. I think there is need to change things because the threat is changing. You know, we're facing a different environment now than we were facing 10 years ago. Now there's hypersonic missiles, and there's cyber threats, and there's submarines. North Korea is talking about tactical nuclear weapons. So because the threat is evolving, I think the U.S. Force posture with its allies needs to evolve too. I think the problem may be that if the U.S. makes adjustments, the public may misinterpret that as somehow a lessening of the commitment. But it's just a modernization. The point is to stay current.
Right. Mr. Manning, what is your thought on this?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. If you look at the whole full spectrum of ballistic missile and nuclear improvements that North Korea has made, and the point as Mark pointed out, they're talking about tactical nuclear weapons. They just fired off something that an IRBM pretty close to being the ICBM that they've had a moratorium about. So the strategic balance is changing, and to be, for deterrence to be credible, we need to adjust how we structure our forces and work with our allies in order to do that.
And earlier, the White House released a 19-page document about Indo-Pacific strategy. Mr. Manning, what was the major point from the strategy?
Well, I have to concede I'm a bit cynical about this. I was involved in the first East Asia Strategy Initiative in 1991. And if you go back and look at that document, there isn't a tremendous amount of change over the last 30 years. I think one thing I was puzzled about was the timing, because they've held back their national security strategy because of events between Russia and Ukraine, and yet they put this forward independently. So that's a bit confusing. But I think I didn't see a lot new in it. I think they were trying to reaffirm the Indo-Pacific as a strategic priority for the United States, and outline some of the things they're doing. I think there's a problem because the U.S. has vacated a lot of the economic space, and that's a huge gap, a big hole in our Indo-Pacific strategy that has yet to be filled. Even as China is talking about joining TPP, which we started, and RCEP has come into play, and the Pan-Asian trade arrangement, and so on. So I think that's a challenge that they have to step up to. But I think the purpose was quite clear. I didn't see a lot of, as I say, anything that jumped out at me as a new idea or a new commitment.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Manning, just follow up on that. So you're saying that the U.S. needed to come up with more tangible measures to develop alliance in the economic side.
Yes, look, the business of Asia is business. And, China is now the largest trading partner of pretty much all our allies and partners in the region, and a major investor, and so on. And so there's a perception in the region, because the U.S., we remember both the Bush and Obama administrations created TPP as a way of disciplining China. In other words, it was presented as our way to try to shape the future rules of trade, and then we tore it up and walked away, and so a lot of Asians are wondering if the U.S. is a perception of U.S. Declining role or declining influence, and they want us, and there's an appetite for more reaffirmation of the U.S. presence and active activity in the region.
Mr. Tokola, what was your takeaway?
I agree with Bob. I think the weak part is the trade strategy. I think the Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is referred to in the Indo-Pacific strategy, needs to be fleshed out more. It does read a little bit like an apology note for having not signed the TPP. On the other hand, the line between economics and national security is blurring. So the issues that we used to think of as being economic, like supply chain resiliency or protection of digital networks or 5G or control of cyberspace, those are now national security issues, and they need to be dealt with in different sorts of ways. So it may be that we do need more flexible groupings of countries talk about those issues specifically. And so maybe a big international trade framework is not appropriate for our time. What I would say about the Indo-Pacific strategy is it's not a doctrine, it's a checklist. It's a to-do list of things we'd like to work on. If you go through the 19 pages, there's lots of details in there about things like green maritime networks or student exchanges or infrastructure or vaccines. The thing to do is come back in a year or two and go through that checklist and see how many of those things have happened. That's the way to judge it.
All right. And the strategy also talked about North Korea. It said the U.S. will continue to seek serious dialogue, but at the same time will remain prepared to defeat any aggression if necessary. Mr. Tokola, what does this tell you? It doesn't sound that much different from what we have been hearing.
No, it's not. It's not very different. I think at this point, the Biden administration is still waiting for some sign North Korea is prepared to talk. I mean, the Biden administration has said anywhere, anytime, any subject. So the door is open. I think North Korea is a bit preoccupied with domestic concerns and therefore is not quite ready to engage in diplomacy yet. But I think at the same time, we shouldn't be just waiting. I think the U.S. and South Korea and other countries should be preparing for what to do when talks can resume. I don't think the denuclearization in exchange for sanctions relief is a plausible framework. Hasn't worked before. I think we need to find some different subjects to talk about.
Mr. Manning, shall we pay attention to the wording that, the U.S. is ready to defeat any aggression from North Korea?
No, the U.S. has been saying that for at least 30 years. I don't think that's new. I think it's important that we put down that marker for North Korea. That if you do anything stupid, you may no longer exist. On the diplomacy side, I think Kim Jong-un has been seized with COVID, and he's really turned into a major porcupine. They closed off the border with China. They're only gradually reopened pieces of it, and so that's a factor as well. At the same time, he's building up nuclear and missile capabilities that I think are designed to force the United States to accept them as a nuclear weapon state. That's his goal. And so it's important that we make it clear that we don't accept that we have these UN sanctions in place, and we continue to respond. The other factor that's going on is a South Korean election. And I think, the North Koreans have just disregarded President Moon, and Kim may be waiting for the next administration in Seoul to unveil whatever his intentions are. So that's a factor the U.S. has to look at closely. And as Mark said, we need to think through what our responses be, what our bottom lines are. And that's why I think the U.S., the recent meeting in Hawaii, U.S., South Korea, Japan was so important.
Mm-hmm. And this Indo-Pacific strategy seems to be emphasizing cooperation with South Korea and Japan. It said nearly every major Indo-Pacific challenge requires close cooperation among the U.S. allies and partners, particularly Japan and South Korea. Mr. Manning, what kind of challenges is this talking about? Not only North Korea, obviously.
No, it's talking about China. I think if you go back to the March Biden-Moon summit, there was a lot of, the press kind of missed it, but there was a lot of South Korean commitments to cooperate on technology, on 5G, on a whole range of supply chain issues. So that's an important factor that we're talking about. But most fundamentally, I think the U.S. is concerned about the importance of both defense and intelligence cooperation in real time to deal with the North Korean threat. And so, and as you know, there has been an unfortunate continued tension between South Korea and Japan over history issues, and that doesn't seem to be going away. And so the challenge the U.S. has been trying to address is can we separate out these security and economic issues from the emotional South Korea Japan political issues.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Tokola, Mr. Manning just mentioned about the relationship between the U.S. and South Korea and Japan. The strategy stressed cooperation among the allies. Why is this so important for the U.S.?
Well, it's kind of two levels. I think one is that it is a fundamental part of the Biden administration strategy that we will work with networks of regional allies or networks of allies. So this is a complete change from the Trump administration, which is focused on bilateral relationships. Anything you see the Biden administration do is in terms of groups of countries. And I think this is a big change, especially in the Indo-Pacific, where in the past, the U.S. alliance system was very hub and spoke. It was all based on Washington's ties with individual countries bilaterally. Now I think U.S. policy is very much to try to forge relationships among the allies, not just with the U.S. So that's a part of it in general. Specifically, the relationship between Japan and South Korea and the United States, that trilateral relationship is fundamental because Northeast Asia is where the center of gravity is in Asia. And Japan and South Korea are both large, important, fundamentally necessary allies in democracies and free market economies. So seeing those three countries work together is very important to achieve almost anything.
Even at the Hawaii meeting among the U.S., South Korea, and Japan, a lot of emphasis was put on the trilateral cooperation. And one of the key topics there was Ukraine. Mr. Tokola, what is the U.S. expecting South Korea and Japan to do as allies?
I don't think anything physically. I think it's necessary that they join the international community of democracies in condemning Russia's threatening behavior. And so Russia, I think, does respond to international community. And so it will matter to them very much what other countries have to say, not just the U.S. and the EU and NATO, but the Pacific allies too. That matters.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Maddy, you earlier gave us a little bit skeptical view about the Indo-Pacific strategy the Biden administration released. What should be the vision for the U.S. about its alliance in the region?
You know, given the preponderance in the global economy of Asian nations, India, China, East Asia, it is of importance for American security and prosperity, and we need to be able to demonstrate that, have policies that address a whole range of issues that take advantage of that economy, make sure our businesses have market access in the region, make sure our supply lines are secure, working with those in the region. And I think it also requires us to figure out what our relationship with China is going to be, because a lot of this is all driven by China. And I think what we've seen really going back to the end of the Trump period is a lot of assumptions we had about China have been proven wrong, that China is a global competitor, and we have yet to define the terms of that competition, the framework for that competition, and where the areas of cooperation are going to be. I think that's critical in shaping, and there's an interaction between the rest of our Indo-Pacific strategy and U.S.-China relationship.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Tokola, I just wanted to ask if you had an additional thought about the what should be and what is the U.S. vision for the region, in the Pacific region.
Yeah, I mean, one of the good things about being out of government is I can say what I actually think. And to be blunt, I think if I was a Pacific country, if I was South Korea or Japan or Australia, I would worry about the United States, how reliable the U.S. is in the long run. So I don't have any assurance of my own the United States foreign policy is going to be predictable over the next decade. U.S. politics has gotten difficult. So for those countries, I think it's important that they do hedge against the U.S. They should think about how to cooperate more among themselves. You know, the community of democracies is more than just the U.S. And I think for our allies, it's important for them to get to know each other, work together, cooperate, just in case the U.S. is not reliable.
Yeah, I think we have seen a lot of this. You know, during the Trump years, Japan stepped up and was really filling a vacuum for American leadership that we vacated. I think with going forward with TPP after we walked away from it, in its response to the Belt and Road Initiative with Japanese aid and development projects, and the whole concept of free and open Pacific stems from a speech that former Prime Minister Abe made in 2007. So this is a very much, and the other point I would make is there's been a huge trend of intra-Asian security cooperation over the last decade or so. India, Japan, Vietnam, Australia, Japan, a whole range of networks of security cooperation, some of them independent of the United States. And I think this is part of the hedging that Mark was talking about.
And that actually promotes U.S. interests if they cooperate more. So it's good for us.
Right. Meanwhile, Thomas Ojea Quintana, Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in North Korea, is visiting now South Korea. There he met with those who are affected by North Korea's human rights violations, including defectors and families of abductees. And some of them handed over a petition urging the United Nations to conduct a fact-finding investigation into human rights violations committed by North Korean regime. With the Special Rapporteur preparing to submit his last report as a mandate holder, we'll have to see whether the United Nations can come up with more tangible measures to hold North Korea accountable. Mr. Tokola and Mr. Manning, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.